The courtroom had been prepared. The legal teams were seated. A sealed copy of Diana's final testament rested beneath the judge's hand. But King Charles never entered the building. Minutes before he was expected to give evidence, the monarch received a private explanation of what the document truly contained, and refused to appear. His absence was not a delay. It was a decision that shook the crown. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles stood in his study, staring at the final paragraph as though the words had changed shape. He read it twice, removed his glasses, and placed them beside the papers with an unsteady hand. The Royal Probate Division, the court branch that settles disputes over wills and inherited property, had summoned him to answer questions about a restricted clause in Diana's will. When an aide asked whether the car should be brought forward, the king did not look up. "There will be no appearance," he said. The decision mattered because the hearing was not about a forgotten jewel or disputed photograph. Diana's former estate trustees had asked the court to clarify a sealed directive covering her letters, possessions, and the rights of William and Harry. A trustee is someone responsible for protecting property for beneficiaries, and these trustees believed the palace had kept material that should have passed directly to her sons. Charles was no longer facing only an old family wound. He was facing the possibility of being questioned under oath about whether officials had delayed, redirected, or concealed what Diana intended her children to receive. William learned of the refusal while waiting near the courthouse entrance. The prince stopped in the corridor, tightened his grip around a folder, and asked the solicitor beside him whether his father understood what an empty chair would say. He knew the newly interpreted clause was explosive. It gave Diana's sons unrestricted control over a private archive containing correspondence from her marriage's final years, including records the sovereign and palace household were forbidden to withhold. Silence spread through the legal chamber. The judge looked toward the untouched witness chair, while William froze outside, caught between loyalty to the monarch and duty to his mother. Charles had believed absence would protect him from the most dangerous questions. Instead, his refusal gave the court grounds to consider something more damaging, placing Diana's sealed memorandum into the official record, where its meaning could no longer be controlled behind palace doors. Charles had avoided the courtroom, but in doing so, he had placed William directly between his mother's final wishes and his father's deepest fear. For the public, the dispute appeared to involve inheritance law and a missing royal witness. For William, it was far more painful. The document belonged to his mother. The man refusing to answer for it was his father. And as the prince stood inside a silent courthouse chamber, he understood that any choice he made would wound someone whose blood ran through his own veins. William sat beside Diana's former solicitor and rested his fingers against the sealed inventory. The document was a formal list of every item held in the private archive, written so courts could track what belonged to whom. That mattered, because the papers were not crown property. They had been reserved for him and Harry personally, beyond royal household control. The future king asked why a mother's clear instruction had taken decades to reach her sons. Charles felt the pressure building at Clarence House. The king paced beside a cold fireplace, while Camilla watched him search for words. He believed the archive could expose private arguments and painful choices from his collapsing marriage. Appearing in court would not simply reopen old wounds. It could force him to defend decisions made before he wore the crown, under oath before a public ready to judge. Camilla remained still as he explained what the sealed index contained. An index is a guide showing which subjects and names appear inside a larger collection, and one entry referred directly to correspondence concerning her during the breakdown of the marriage. The queen consort lowered herself into a chair and asked whether Diana had written those pages herself or preserved letters sent by others. Charles could not answer. His silence frightened her more than any accusation. Harry's absence carried its own force. Through a signed legal statement delivered by his solicitor, he supported the complete release of their mother's archive and rejected any further palace restriction. William read the statement twice, hearing his brother's anger beneath the careful language. The prince knew that agreement between them was rare now, which made this moment matter more. Diana's final request had united her sons, where almost everything else had divided them. William turned back to the sealed inventory as the solicitor placed one final note beside it. The paper had been written years earlier, preserved in the lawyer's confidential file, and linked the archive to a private confrontation no one inside the courtroom had yet described. That confrontation had transformed Diana's fear into a legally binding safeguard forever. To understand why Diana created such an extraordinary safeguard, the court would have to return to the night when she decided that private assurances from the palace could no longer be trusted. The crisis did not begin inside a courtroom. It began years earlier, behind a closed door, after Diana attended a private meeting, expecting reassurance, and walked away convinced that her own story could be rewritten without her consent. That evening became the point of no return. Within 48 hours, she summoned her solicitor and added the instruction now threatening to divide a king from his heir. Diana had feared that her letters, recorded reflections, and family keepsakes might disappear into private royal custody. The royal archives were the institution's protected collection of records, and access could be controlled for decades. That mattered because William and Harry might inherit jewels while being denied the truth behind them. She wanted her sons to receive the uncensored account of what she had endured as a wife, mother, and outsider. The warning became real during the private Kensington Palace meeting later called the Blue Drawing Room Conversation. A senior courtier told Diana that certain correspondence could be classified as crown-related material and might never pass to her children. Crown-related meant the palace could treat private papers as connected to the monarchy rather than to the person who wrote them. The distinction sounded technical. To her, it felt like erasure. Diana remained calm until the courtier left. Then she closed the door, removed a sapphire ring, and placed it on the table before her closest advisor. "They must never inherit only the version chosen for them," she said. Her advisor preserved that sentence in a written account, creating the first documented record of the moment her fear hardened into resolve. She was no longer asking the palace for reassurance. She was preparing to make refusal legally impossible. The following morning, Diana contacted solicitor Margaret Ellison and ordered a confidential codicil. A codicil is a formal addition that changes or strengthens an existing will without replacing it. Margaret drafted protection for the princess's letters, journals, recorded notes, and a sealed memorandum intended only for William and Harry. Diana reviewed every line and insisted that no sovereign, royal spouse, palace secretary, or household official could alter, delay, or permanently restrict those materials once both sons reached legal age. Years later, that safeguard returned with devastating force. One palace authorization appeared to conflict directly with Diana's instruction, and Charles's signature stood beneath the approval. The paper transformed an old fear into a present accusation. It also forced William to confront the man who had approved what his mother had tried to prevent. What had begun as Diana's private act of protection was about to become a face-to-face reckoning between the husband she left behind and the son determined to hear her final voice. Charles had refused to face the court, but he could not refuse his eldest son. That evening, William entered the king's private library without advisors, lawyers, or household officials. The two men stood on opposite sides of a table holding Diana's sealed inventory. One saw a threat to the crown. The other saw the final unfulfilled request of a mother who could no longer defend herself. William had left the courthouse and demanded an immediate private audience. He refused to let secretaries, lawyers, or palace aides carry his words. The prince wanted his father to hear the accusation directly. Between them lay a 2004 palace authorization, a formal approval allowing several boxes from Diana's private estate storage to be moved into restricted royal custody for historical and constitutional review. That phrase meant officials could examine material they believed might affect the monarchy's public record or legal position. William placed the authorization on the table and pointed to Charles's signature. He asked why their mother's property had been moved without either son being informed. The future king kept his voice controlled, but his anger was unmistakable. Charles stared at the page before answering. He insisted that the transfer had been intended to protect deeply personal material from sale, public exploitation, or people eager to profit from Diana's pain. Charles believed he had acted as a guardian, not a thief. Yet William would not accept that defense. The prince opened the estate inventory and showed him 3 entries marked with broken seals. The boxes had been opened before reaching royal custody, despite written instructions that they remain untouched until delivered to the beneficiaries, the people legally entitled to inherit them. That detail mattered because opening the containers meant someone had examined Diana's private words before her sons ever received them. Silence stretched between father and son. Charles finally admitted that palace lawyers had warned him the restriction might conflict with Diana's testament, the legal document stating how her property should be handled after death. He had approved the transfer anyway because he believed protecting the monarchy outweighed the exact wording of her private instructions. William stepped back, as though the confession had struck him physically. William then revealed the court had found the original transfer log. The record did not merely show when the boxes were moved. It named the official who ordered them opened, and that name would drag the dispute far beyond one family argument. Charles looked away, while his son waited for one final honest answer. The argument was no longer about whether Diana's wishes had been delayed. It was about who possessed enough authority to override them, and whether that authority had ever legally existed. Behind the king's refusal stood a quieter force, the machinery of the royal household. Signatures had been collected, boxes had been moved, and access had been denied through language few people outside the palace could challenge. But institutions do not act alone. Somewhere inside that chain was a person who had looked at Diana's final instruction and decided the crown's needs mattered more. Malcolm Avery entered the probate chamber with trembling hands and lowered himself into the witness chair. The former keeper of private royal papers had overseen the transfer of Diana's archive into a Windsor repository under a special household classification. The keeper was the official responsible for protecting sensitive royal correspondence, but that authority did not allow him to seize privately inherited property without the beneficiary's consent or a court order. That mattered because William and Harry, not the palace, were legally entitled to the material. Malcolm opened a documented account he had prepared for the hearing and admitted that he had spent years believing silence protected both the monarchy and Diana's sons. He said the archive had been described to him as dangerous, not because it contained state secrets, but because its contents might reopen old wounds and weaken public trust in Charles. The retired official paused, then confessed that fear had made obedience feel like duty. William watched through a secure video link from a side chamber. When Malcolm described the papers as potentially destabilizing, the prince's expression hardened. He understood what those words had allowed officials to do: turn his mother's private history into an institutional threat, then use that label to deny her children access. The future king leaned forward as the testimony reached the name behind the order. Malcolm revealed, through the recorded court examination, that the sovereign's private legal advisor had given him verbal instructions to inspect the boxes and identify correspondence involving Charles, Camilla, or constitutional officials. He also produced a note, preserved in his personal file. Diana's solicitor had warned that opening or removing the boxes would breach the estate's obligations and violate the rights of William and Harry. Malcolm had read that warning. He had continued anyway. The judge set down her pen and ordered every remaining container frozen. She announced that one sealed packet would be opened before representatives of Diana's sons, regardless of the king's absence. Malcolm closed his eyes, while William remained fixed on the screen, knowing the next document could expose why the palace had feared her voice for so long. For decades, the palace had controlled the door to Diana's final testimony. Now the court had taken the key, and the first sealed packet was about to be opened. No explosive accusation emerged when the first packet was opened. Instead, the room heard something far more difficult to dismiss: Diana's own measured explanation of why she had preserved the archive. Her words were not written for revenge. They were written for her sons. And as William listened to them being read aloud, the legal battle changed into a deeply personal judgment on everyone who had kept them hidden. Margaret Ellison placed the packet beneath the court's document camera and broke the seal under judicial supervision. The former solicitor unfolded a handwritten memorandum, a private explanatory note attached to the disputed clause of Diana's will. That mattered because the paper did more than list property. It explained why the princess had protected the archive and what she expected her sons to learn from it. Margaret read slowly. Diana wrote that William and Harry must understand the difference between duty freely chosen and obedience imposed through fear. The words carried no demand for revenge. They asked for honesty. She wanted her sons to decide for themselves what should remain private and what deserved a place in the historical record, meaning the official collection future generations might study. William lowered his head as the reading continued. The prince pressed his thumb against his wedding ring and fought to remain composed before the legal team. He had expected anger from his mother's pages. Instead, he heard restraint, care, and a warning shaped by pain. That contrast made the concealment harder to defend. Diana had not tried to destroy the monarchy. She had tried to protect her children from being controlled by it. Charles received a secure transcript at Clarence House. The king read the line describing Diana's fear that her sons might one day be protected from the truth in the name of the institution, then folded the page without speaking. His refusal to attend now carried a legal cost. By staying away, he had lost the chance to request confidential handling through direct testimony, allowing the court to treat the estate's documents as largely uncontested. The absence mattered because silence could no longer shield him once Diana's written purpose became the strongest evidence before the court. The balance shifted at once. Before the judge could issue a ruling, Charles sent a private request through his solicitor. He wanted to meet William alone and surrender an object that had never appeared on any inventory. The prince agreed, but only after asking one question: why had it been hidden until now? The fallout had weakened the king's legal position, but the object he now carried into his son's private room would determine whether their relationship could survive the truth. There were no officials in the room. No lawyers waited outside the door. Charles arrived carrying a single cream envelope marked in Diana's handwriting, an item that had never appeared in the estate records or palace transfer logs. William did not reach for it immediately. For the first time since the crisis began, father and son were not arguing over authority. They were facing what each had lost. Charles had chosen a small sitting room at Windsor because he wanted no witnesses, no courtiers, and no legal advisors shaping the silence between them. Windsor was not merely a royal residence. It was one of the monarchy's principal homes, a place where private family decisions often carried public consequences. That mattered because this meeting could determine whether the legal dispute ended in humiliation or honesty. Charles placed the envelope on the table and explained that Diana had sent it during the final year of their marriage. The king said she had asked him to give it to William when their son was old enough to understand the pain behind her words. He admitted through the private conversation that he had kept it because he feared the letter would define him before he could explain his own failures. William looked at the seal, but did not touch it. The prince asked whether his father had opened the envelope. When Charles answered no, he replied that withholding it had still been a choice. The words were quiet, yet they carried more force than any accusation spoken in court. The future king understood why fear had guided his father, but understanding did not erase the years of silence. William finally broke the seal. Diana's message warned that royal duty could become destructive when family members confused silence with loyalty. She urged her son to remember that protecting an institution should never require denying the truth inside a family. The letter mattered because it did not ask him to hate Charles. It asked him to recognize harm without allowing pain to become his inheritance. Diana's final compassion changed the room. She wrote that understanding a parent's failure did not mean repeating it, excusing it, or pretending it caused no damage. William folded the letter and said it would remain private. Then he told Charles he would support the court's release of the archive to its rightful heirs, and expected his father to end every public objection. Charles nodded slowly, knowing surrender was now the only path left toward reconciliation. The private battle between father and son had reached its turning point. Now the monarchy had to face a public that had already interpreted the king's empty courtroom chair for itself. By morning, the legal language had disappeared beneath one unforgettable image: an empty witness chair reserved for the king. Newspapers did not need the contents of Diana's archive to understand the symbolism. The monarch had been summoned to explain why her final wishes were delayed, and he had stayed away. Across Britain, the silence inside that courtroom became louder than any statement Buckingham Palace could release. Buckingham Palace answered with a carefully worded announcement. The statement said Charles respected the judicial process, but had declined attendance to protect private family matters and constitutional dignity. Constitutional dignity meant preserving the Crown's formal authority and public standing during legal conflict. Yet the explanation mattered, because it sounded less like protection and more like distance. The king had avoided the witness chair, but he had not escaped its meaning. The probate judge responded in open court. Probate is the legal process used to settle wills, estates, and inheritance rights, and she confirmed that Diana's beneficiaries could not lose those rights because one party held royal status. The proceedings would continue. That decision mattered because it placed family inheritance above palace privilege and told the public that the monarchy could not pause ordinary justice. Camilla watched the coverage alone from a private sitting room. The Queen Consort saw broadcasters replay the empty chair image and understood that viewers would connect her name to the hidden correspondence, whatever the papers eventually revealed. She muted the television, but the silence offered no relief. Diana's archive had become a judgment before a single private letter reached the public. William left the courthouse beneath a storm of shouted questions. The prince kept walking until a reporter asked whether he intended to expose his father. He stopped and answered, "This is about honoring my mother, not humiliating my father." His restraint changed the tone. The future king denied the palace an easy defense because revenge could no longer be blamed for the legal challenge. The Daily Chronicle captured the public mood the next morning. Its black and white front page showed the untouched chair beneath the headline, "The King Who Would Not Answer Diana." By dusk, a quiet crowd had gathered outside Kensington Palace. Among the flowers lay one handwritten card. "A mother's voice belongs first to her children." For millions watching, the dispute now tested whether royal power could remain accountable to private truth at all. Charles now faced the final choice. He could resist and deepen the wound, or accept that Diana's instruction had survived every effort to contain it. The world had delivered its emotional judgment, but only the king's final decision could determine whether the monarchy answered this crisis with pride or humility. Charles did not return to the courtroom to defend the past. Instead, he sent a signed declaration, accepting the court's authority and withdrawing every palace objection to the transfer of Diana's private archive. It was not an acquittal, and it was not a victory. It was something rarer inside royal history. A sovereign admitting that the crown's instinct to protect itself had overridden a mother's right to speak to her sons. Charles accepted the judgment in writing. A signed declaration is a formal statement carrying legal responsibility, and his words ended the palace resistance that had shaped the crisis. The court ruled that Diana's letters, journals, recordings, and protected personal effects belonged under the joint control of William and Harry, exactly as her testament intended. That mattered because her sons would finally decide how their mother's private voice should be protected, not officials acting in the crown's name. Royal archivists received a direct order to complete a supervised transfer. These archivists are specialists who preserve and catalog historic records, but this time, independent observers would watch every step. They had to list each opened container, explain every broken seal, and identify anything still missing. The correction mattered because accountability required more than returning boxes. It required a record of how Diana's wishes had been delayed. William met his father after the ruling and refused revenge. The prince said he would not release private material simply to punish anyone, yet he would not permit the archive to disappear behind palace control again. Charles listened as his son promised to protect family papers while preserving historically important records through independent oversight. The king understood that restraint had not erased the wrongdoing. It had given him one final chance to answer it honestly. Camilla heard the boundary directly from Charles. The Queen Consort was told that neither of them would hold authority over Diana's archive, and she accepted the decision without protest. She recognized that the princess's personal voice could not be edited by those whose lives were tied to the pain inside it. William carried the cream envelope and sealed memorandum into the secure transfer room himself. He placed his mother's handwritten instruction on top of the archive box. paused, and said, "It is where she asked it to be." That was the victory. Truth returned without becoming vengeance. The courtroom chair remained empty, but Diana's voice finally reached the sons she had entrusted with it. And the monarchy emerged humbled, changed, and unable ever again to claim that silence was the same as duty. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.